There is a new series on Peacock called WWE Evil, which is a series of hour-long documentaries narrated by John Cena, focusing on different wrestlers and their turns to the dark side and what makes them a great heel. They dropped all the episodes at once, so they're all on demand if you want to watch them. They start with Hollywood Hulk Hogan, and then they have episodes for The Miz, Sasha Banks, The Brothers of Destruction, Randy Orton, Stephanie McMahon, Ric Flair, and Roman Reigns. You probably saw the Randy Orton clip floating around social media this week where he talks about how he gets into that zone, he lets all the blood, he kind of leans over and lets the blood flow to the front of his face, and then he starts smacking himself. That's how he gets himself psyched up when he's in heel mode, heel viper mode. I probably should have started with that. That looked interesting. But I started with the Hogan one, since that was the first episode, so that's what I wanted to review here real quick, is the Hollywood Hogan episode. They interviewed a bunch of talking heads for it, including Hogan himself. Eric Bischoff was all over this thing. Jimmy Hart was all over this thing. Kevin Nash, DDP, Booker T, Shawn Michaels had a brief little comment that he made. Bruce Pritchard, Vince Russo. Yes, they covered the Bash at the Beach incident. They stuck Peter Rosenberg in there. They had a brief comment from David Shoemaker. But they also had Mario Lopez, and they had Dr. Phil, and they had Corey Taylor from Slipknot, who talked about what it was like to be a young wrestling fan when Hogan turned heel. Forget that for a second. We had Dr. fucking Phil analyzing the psyche of a wrestling heel. We had a huckster talking about the Hulkster. I'm not sure who the bigger worker is. Is it Dr. Phil or is it Hulk Hogan? If you are a hardcore wrestling fan, you're not going to learn anything new here. It is a lot of the same recycled stories you've heard before with some exaggerations thrown in. I think this is something a lapsed fan would really enjoy. Someone who maybe doesn't watch wrestling anymore, they don't follow it as closely as they used to. But they lived through that era. They lived through that Monday Night War, NWO period. Some of the backstage stuff they would probably hear about for the first time watching this. Like WCW not having a third man. When Scott Hall went out there, I think it was the Great American Bash, and he said, we're going to have a third man. You find 3 guys, we'll have our third man. They didn't have one. They hadn't confirmed yet who the third guy was going to be. And they talked about how Sting was the backup choice after Bischoff initially pitched the idea to Hogan of going heel, and Hogan basically said, get the fuck out of my trailer. or his house, wherever they were. I think it was in his house. Hogan didn't want to hear it. Because even though his popularity, with some of the crowds may have been waning and there were more boos and stuff, he still got a lot of cheers. He still sold a lot of merch. And he didn't want to do it. So Sting was going to be the backup choice. Then Hogan probably realized, wait a minute. They're going to go with Sting here and give him the big push. Wait just a minute here. Yeah, he had a change of heart all of a sudden. He thought about it some more. The way that they, and again, this is where they took creative license with some of this stuff, in terms of the timeline and everything. I think the way they sort of presented it was, Hogan initially wasn't really interested, but the crowds, they then realized, were starting to turn against the Hulkster. And as he saw this happening and playing out in real time, that's kind of when he realized, wait a minute, brother. We might have to go a different way with this. Timeline is a little off here, but that is more or less what happened. Crowds were booing Hogan long before Eric Bischoff came up with this whole concept. I mean, that had started, I think, the year before. And actually, they had tinkered with the idea of a Hogan heel turn, where Hogan came out, he was dressed in all black, just like he was as Hollywood Hogan. That happened almost a year before he even turned. They didn't talk about that. They didn't talk about his trip to the dark side in late 95. That wasn't addressed here. But they did talk about Bash at the Beach, and, they talked about Hulk changing his mind and agreeing to turn heel, which, no exaggeration, the biggest thing in the world, if you were a wrestling fan, the biggest thing in the world at that time, when it happened, was Hulk Hogan turning heel and joining the NWO. And we see Hogan dropping the leg on Randy Savage. It was one of those rare, truly shocking, game-changing moments. We hear about moving the needle and changing the game, right? These are words that are thrown around, that I think they're thrown around so much they don't really mean hardly anything anymore. You want to see a truly shocking, game-changing moment. You watch Hulk Hogan walk down to that ring at Bash at the Beach while Bobby Heenan wonders whose side is he on, and then he drops the leg on the Macho Man. That turned out to be the mother of all game-changing moments for WCW. It talked about Hogan's creative control clause in WCW, and Kevin Nash recounted the "that don't work for me brother" story, which is always great. But that wasn't even the best part. The best part of that, talking about creative control and everything, was listening to Hogan talk about how everybody else's ego was raging out of control. How the inmates were running the asylum, brother. I mean, he was just minding his own business, Hogan was, with his creative control. He said all of this with a straight face, by the way. I am at the point, though, and I reached this point a long time ago, when I hear Hogan talk about certain things, and in some cases just flat out fucking lie through his teeth and tell tall tales, I truly don't know. I truly don't. If he just makes shit up and knows that he's full of shit, or if a lot of that stuff he has said it for so long that he now believes it. And he has blurred the lines of fantasy and reality, and he actually believes a lot of the shit that comes out of his mouth. I truly don't know. I don't know where Terry Bollea ends and the worker Hulk Hogan begins. I think they're just one and the same at this point. They position Hogan against The Rock at WrestleMania 18 as a passing of the torch deal, which is weird given how big of a star Rock already was. I mean, the man had already headlined the previous 3 WrestleManias. He headlined WrestleMania 15. He headlined WrestleMania 16. He headlined WrestleMania 17. But now, he's never touched Hogan before in his life. But this is going to be the passing of the torch. There was no torch for Hogan to pass by that point. And I absolutely love that match. It's one of my all-time favorite matches, but it's the typical WWE version of how they tell these stories. The Bash at the Beach deal with Russo is addressed. They told a portion of the story. They left out a lot of details. They presented it as Hogan not knowing that Jeff Jarrett was going to lay down for him in the first match when he put his foot on Jarrett's chest and pinned him for the title. The way they presented this, again, if you didn't know any better, if you were a new fan or a lapsed fan or whatever, you would watch this and think, wow, Hogan didn't know that Jarrett was going to lay down for him. Which is not true. That part of it was planned all along. It was Russo coming out later on and shooting on Hogan that Hogan wasn't expecting, and that's what led to the lawsuit and him leaving WCW. They went through all that before ending with the NWO coming to WWE, the Hogan Rock stuff, and then the turn right back immediately after WrestleMania from, the black to the red and yellow. And that's how they ended the episode. Look, it's fun to go back and relive some of these big moments, but as documentaries go, I mean, this was very basic, very standard stuff. Hogan is the only man, though, to have been such a transformative figure as both a babyface and a heel. He basically had 2 different careers, and in both cases, he brought 2 different companies, the 2 biggest promotions in the country, maybe in the world, at the time, to heights that they had never reached before. And he did it with Vince McMahon's vision behind him and the WWF marketing machine behind him, but they latched onto Hogan as their superstar in the mid-'80s, and they launched themselves national, just into the stratosphere on the back of Hulkamania. And then you turn around 10 years later, a decade later, you fast forward, and Hogan did it all over again, this time as the bad guy, working for WCW under Eric Bischoff's vision. He did it again. He took WCW, or had a very big part in taking WCW from the number 2 to the number 1 promotion. Who else can say that they've done that? Who else can say that they have had like these 2 different careers and 2 totally different roles that just uplifted their respective companies, I mean, in the way that Hogan was able to do it. Whether you like the guy or not, there is nobody else who can say they did what Hogan did. And that's something that nobody could ever take away from him.